The killing of Trayvon Martin and George Zimmerman's subsequent acquittal sparked anger, recriminations, and a new dialogue about race, culture, privilege, and economic justice in America. To hear how people of faith are responding to these issues, let's welcome Reverend Quentin Mumphery, an associate pastor at New Life Covenant Church in Chicago. I'm interested in, hearing what was your reaction to Trayvon Martin's death, but also to George Zimmerman's acquittal.
Well, I would say that my reaction to both the death and the acquittal was one first of sadness. I would say sadness, grief, anger. All of those emotions came to mind and came to the forefront of my thought process. The murder was tragic in that a young life was snuffed out far too soon. We're talking about a young man, a teenager. I have teenage nieces and nephews, and so to think of a young person their age losing their life so tragically was saddening. And then, not that a verdict of guilty is a vindication to bring the life back, but it is a sense of closure for the family and those that grieve. And so to know that that verdict was not handed down in the way that many of us had hoped that it would come down. So now that family is left to deal with not only the sense of grief and the sense of loss, but they don't have an opportunity to have closure in that there's no justice for them in this death.
And so it's very clear the consensus is there was anger and a lot of hurt.
Definitely.
If you can just share with me what that also tells us about race in America.
That's a great question. Well, I think the first thing that tells us about race in America is the fact that, number one, it's a myth to say that we're living in a post-racial society. I've heard that term thrown around many times, and it's a myth. We are not living in a post-racial America. You mentioned earlier the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington. We also recently celebrated the 50th anniversary, well, not celebrated, but we acknowledged the 50th anniversary of the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama, where 4 little girls lost their lives. So again, you have the loss of young lives that had a racial overtone and implications to it. So I think the fact that we're living in a society where we have an African American and black president, for some people it would seem to suggest that, oh, we're okay. America is racially reconciled, and we're not.
With the killings that are taking place within black communities, some may even say, well, when you look at racial profiling, it's justified based on the violence that's spilling out. Not that I'm saying that I agree, but some would say that. So I'm interested in hearing from you. How do we then deride this fear of the black man, or should I say this imagined or created fear of the black man, against those who actually do point to gangs and drugs and violent offenses?
Well, to be very blunt, I think that's a load of crock. Let me, if I could be so blunt. First of all, the fear of the black man is not a recent construct in American history. The fact that African American males are disproportionately involved in the criminal justice system, are disproportionately incarcerated, are disproportionately involved in violent crimes is not the root cause of the fear of the black man in America. The reality is that the black man has been feared in America and has been an object of scorn for hundreds of years, ever since slavery. And so when we go back to the 1600s and 1700s, there were stereotypes of black men, that black men were always looked at as savages and aggressors, and during slavery, black men were looked at the ones that the white women needed to be protected from. And so there were no gangs during that time. There were no drug dealing. The slaves weren't selling drugs on the plantations. And so to say that the perception of black males being racially profiled is justified because they're dangerous, well, there's always been a perception that black men are dangerous, whether it was merited or not.
At the March on Washington, Dr. King shared with us that the Negro is not free because he lives on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast sea of material prosperity. How do his words relate to the Trayvon Martin case?
I would say that his words relate to the Trayvon Martin case in some pretty direct ways. I'm not making an assertion about Trayvon Martin's family's economic situation. The fact that his father's fiance lived in that community seems to imply that they are not destitute. However, there are millions of other young black males like Trayvon Martin who look like him, who fit his similar profile, who may not have had the greatest track record academically in school, who may have had some, issues with smoking or other things of that nature. who fit his profile, but they are in a different socioeconomic situation than him. The reality is when we look at the numbers of employment, although we talk about the nation's employment rates hovering between 10 and 13%, the rate for black males is typically 25 to 30%. When we look at young black males between the age of 18 to 25, that number hovers around 50% or even higher in certain communities. And so there is a correlation between your ethnicity, your racial identity, even your age demographic, and your socioeconomic status. So the words of Dr. King ring true today, although there is, I would say, a greater level of opportunity for people today in general, African Americans in particular, than there was in 1963. The fact of the matter is that if we go by the numbers, there is a higher number actually of African Americans living below the poverty level today than there were 50 years ago in 1963.
What would you like to see done by the government, the African American community, and the church so that we can end social injustice? I know it's a big piece.
That is huge. Well, I would say first by the government, I would salute some of the efforts by Attorney General Holder and others to see if there are some other things that can be done to bring justice for this family in this situation. So I think that the government has to, number one, acknowledge that they have a role and a responsibility. And as people of faith, you know, we're charged with the responsibility to pray for those that have leadership over us and to pray for those that are in rulership. So we have to continue to pray that the government, once they get through the shutdown and all of these other things that are going on, would have the wherewithal to do right by those who have been oppressed, who have struggled, and who have kind of been on the receiving end of some pretty negative things in our nation. That's the first thing on the role of the government. As far as the faith community is concerned, I believe that the church has to reclaim its prophetic place. And what I mean by that is, when we go back 50 years ago to the time of Dr. King and the civil rights movement, the church was viewed as the kind of the catalyst of action, of engagement, of protest, of anything that happened concerning a community. The church was at the forefront of it. And so I believe that the church today has to reclaim our place of prominence as what I call a prophetic adjutant, meaning that we are agitators to speak truth to power when necessary. And that truth is not always comfortable. And when we go back in the prophetic tradition of Elijah in the Old Testament, he could not call Ahab on the carpet if he was on Ahab's payroll. And so we have to stand as an independent voice that's, in the words of Shirley Chisholm, unbought and unbossed, and be willing to speak truth to power, to confront the powers that be when they're doing wrong. When there's evil, we have to call it evil. And we can't be afraid to call evil evil. We can't be afraid to call wrong wrong. We can't be afraid to call sin sin, because it's truth and it's God's truth. But we have to speak that truth with grace and love. But it's the truth nonetheless. And so for the African American community, I think that we have to value our own lives. We should not be so laissez-faire in our approach that whenever a young black man is killed, whether it's by another black person or a white person, a Latino person, a purple person, we should not take that lightly. We should be grieved by it. We should be disturbed by it. We should be distraught by it. We should not just go through our daily routines and say, oh, another young person got killed, but it should break our hearts. And we as a community, we need to break things like the no snitch policy, and that when we see things that are happening and going on, we can't be so afraid to air our dirty laundry that we don't tell the truth and bring those who are lawbreakers or who are harmful to our communities and to our young people, to bring them to justice.
Thank you, Reverend Mumphery, for your perspective on this very controversial issue.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. I'm Lakeisha Pete for Different Drummers and the Greater Chicago Broadcast Ministries. Keep the faith.